Coming up on Dialogue Weekend, China commemorates the 110th anniversary of the Revolution of 1911, which triggered social transformation and led to the search for a path to national rejuvenation of the country. How does that event affect China today? Senior Chinese diplomat Yang Jiechi and U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan met in Zurich, Switzerland on Wednesday. What are the takeaways from the meeting? And this week's Newsmaker. Now on Dialogue Weekend.
Welcome to this edition of Dialogue Weekend. I'm Xu Qinduo. On Saturday morning, President Xi made remarks at the meeting marking the 110th anniversary of the Revolution of 1911. Beginning with the Wuchang Uprising on October 10th, the 1911 Revolution put an end to China's more than 2,000-year-old monarchy. What did President Xi say, and what's the historic significance of the revolution? And how does its legacy shed light on Chinese and overseas Chinese now? To find out, I'm joined by Victor Gao-Zhikai, Chair Professor at Suzhou University, Christina Wu, Justice of the Peace and Counselor of Georges River Council, Australia. She's also consultant of Australia-China People's Friendship Exchange Association, and Joanna Lei, former Taiwan legislator. Victor, I will start with you here. For those who are not exactly familiar with the Chinese history, give us some background of this 1911 revolution. And against what kind of background it happened, and how significant it is, probably.
Well, first of all, the 1911 revolution was truly a historical turning point in the thousands of years of Chinese history. You know for sure that China was in a feudal society for more than 2,000 years since the Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, founded the Qing dynasty, unifying China. And it lasted till the last dynasty, the Manchu Qing dynasty, which was overthrown because of the 1911 revolution. And the first shot was fired in Wuchang on October the 10th, 1911, which led to eventually the collapse of the Qing dynasty and the formation of the Republic of China. And for the Republic of China, up to October 1949, October the 10th was always the national holiday for the Republic of China. And ever since the nationalist government fled to Taiwan after they lost the Civil War, October the 1st has always been the most important holiday in Taiwan since 1949. So I think the 1911 revolution was important in the Chinese history because it marked the continuity of the Chinese history and also the shift from the feudal society to the republic era of China, and also the formation of the Republic of China, which eventually was replaced in 1949 by the People's Republic of China. It showed the continuity of the Chinese history and also the very important fact that throughout thousands of years there is only one China, and that China should be a united China.
Mm-hmm. Well, Joanna Lei, sitting from Taiwan, how do you make this historical significance of the Revolution 1911?
Certainly, I agree with a lot of the historical recounts, but it is really important to understand the background. During the time of the revolution, China experienced rude awakening by war and Western powers. So it brought in the dominant national identity.
We have some tech problem over there. Christina, look at this the event to remember this 1911 revolution from Australia as overseas Chinese. What do you think it means for Chinese and those who live overseas?
Well, the overseas Chinese played an important role in this 1911 revolution. It initiated the national democratic revolution in China, brought the great liberation of mind, opened the gates for China's progress, spread the idea of democracy and republic. So it has a significant into Chinese history.
Mm-hmm. Victor, in the speech, President Xi said, the revolution of 1911 paved the way for the profound social changes that have taken place in modern China, and the Chinese communists were the most steadfast supporters, loyal collaborators, and faithful successors to the revolution cause initiated by Dr. Sun Yat-sen. How do you see this, this relationship between this revolution and the modernization of the Chinese people?
Well, first of all, as a small point for historical background, the Qing dynasty, which was the last feudal dynasty in China, which lasted for about 260 years, was ruled by the Manchu emperors. And the Manchu is one of the minorities in China. So during the Qing dynasty, the Han Chinese, the majority ethnic group in China, was not the ruling class, at least in the first half of the Qing dynasty. And therefore, for Dr. Sun Yat-sen to overthrow the Manchu dynasty was a very important occasion to rejuvenate not only China as a country, but also the Chinese nation as a nation. It was very much a struggle to emancipate and to liberate the Han Chinese, the majority nation in China, against the rule by a very small minority group in China, which overruled the Han Chinese majority. So in that sense, I think all of us in China supported Dr. Sun Yat-sen because we do not want to live as a second-class citizen in a country ruled by a very small minority group in the country. Now, secondly, by overthrowing the Manchu dynasty, which was a feudal dynasty, and establishing the Republic of China, it brought about all the profound political and social changes in China. People felt empowered. Everyone was treated as equal, and everyone had equal access to the opportunities to advance, for example. And even though China devolved into civil war again very soon, the period of the warlords, for example, but China was very much a united nation. And Chinese people knew that they need to have a better destiny. And throughout all the decades which followed the 1911 revolution, for example, the Communist Party of China emerged as the very important and unifying force for the whole Chinese nation because it brought forward a new message about social equality, which was very, very important, and also to emancipate China from all the unequal treaties imposed by Western powers, for example, and to strive for the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. This was the reason why the communist forces could defeat the nationalist forces in 1949 and establish the People's Republic of China. And ever since then, the Chinese people are very much united behind the leadership of the Communist Party of China, and we call the China since 1949 as the New China, and we are very proud to be citizens of New China, and China is generally speaking recognized in the world, even by countries like the United States, as one country and one China, and the People's Republic of China is the sole legitimate representative of China, and Taiwan is part of China.
Well, Christina, if you look at the role played by the communists, what do you see, what kind of a role played by the communists in upholding the spirit of Dr. Sun Yat-sen?
I think Dr. Sun Yat-sen mentioned the nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. Is that what you are asking me?
Yes, of course.
Question?
It's still, being discussed, and you can see the impact even today, right? Probably people use different terms, but it's basically the content more or less very similar, right?
Yes, yeah. Well, it has a significant implication to modern China. Even back then, China has different ethnic, minority ethnic groups and also Han ethnic groups. So it is important to be united. And also China has big population, 1.4 billion population. And during the time, the Chinese government eliminates the poverty of the population. So that's a significant impact to the rest of the world as well. It also improved what Sun Yat-sen mentioned, the livelihood, people's livelihood and democracy.
That's right. You can see, ultimately, the dream of Dr. Sun Yat-sen has been realized in terms of the livelihood, for example, and other aspects too. Of course, in the speech, Victor, President Xi stressed very much talking about reunification with Taiwan, and he said, and will be realized. Reunification will be realized, and that accords with the basic interests of Taiwan people. So how do you see this resolution of the Taiwan question, which is described in the speech as a weakness to be resolved, and a national rejuvenation becomes a reality when we resolve that?
Well, I think President Xi Jinping said in his speech a very important point. That is, the existence of the Taiwan issue was because China, in the latter years of the Qing dynasty, was very weak, and it was defeated by Japan at that time in the war of 1894-95, and as a result of that, an unequal treaty was imposed on China, and China ceded Taiwan to Japan. And Japan ruled Taiwan for 50 years until they unconditionally surrendered Taiwan back to China at the end of the Second World War. So I think President Xi Jinping is absolutely right. The fact that Taiwan went away from China to Japan was because Qing dynasty was weak and it was enfeebled. And now the reunification of the two sides of the Taiwan Strait will and definitely will happen because China has become strong, and the Chinese people want to be reunited between the Taiwan and the mainland part of China. And this is the mega trend. And I think there is a lot of misunderstanding of the real situation between the two sides of the Taiwan Strait, especially in Western countries or even in the United States. Some people wanted to say that Taiwan is not part of China. Taiwan is a separate country. The fact is completely just the opposite. If you read what President Nixon did in 1971, 72, if they read very carefully what President Carter did in 1979, if they read the three communiques between China and the United States, you will know for sure that the United States actually firmly acknowledged that there is only one China, and PRC is the only sole legitimate representative of China, and Taiwan is part of China. Therefore, I think the reunification of China's mainland with China's Taiwan will happen, and President Xi Jinping delivered a very strong message that this is the megatrend we are living through today.
Well said, the megatrend. Well, let's move on. On Wednesday, Chinese senior diplomat Yang Jiechi met with his U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan for 6 hours of talks in Zurich, Switzerland. Following the phone call between Presidents Xi and Biden on September 9th, the meeting covered a range of priority issues between the two global powers. So what did they talk about, and how will the meeting influence the IC relationship between China and the U.S.? And for this part, I'm joined by Peter Kuznick, professor of history at American University. Well, obviously, yeah, Victor, this relationship, many people would say, both sides actually say, this meeting is, particularly if you compare it to the meeting in Alaska, people would say it's more constructive and more helpful in terms of the bilateral ties. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, I do personally believe that the Zurich meeting between Mr. Yang Jiechi and Mr. Sullivan was better handled. Why? Because the Alaska meeting and the subsequent Tianjin meeting did not result in expected results by either side. And there was a lot of media reports about the negative side of the two meetings. Now, this meeting in Zurich happened not in China or not in the United States. It happened in Switzerland, one of the very important neutral countries, in a third-party country. And then a lot of the discussions were not made known to the public. And I think the two countries did have a good chance to compare notes, to test each other's red lines. For example, China definitely raised a lot of issues in their discussion with the American counterparts. And I think as a result of the meeting, the two sides knew better where the other side stood on this very important red button issues, and I think this will help them to navigate their relations much better going forward. So this is a much better meeting, and this will help laying a better foundation for China-U.S. relations going forward. And the fact that they agree that the virtual summit meeting between President Biden and President Xi Jinping will take place before the end of this year is also very encouraging, not only to China and the United States, but to the rest of the world.
Yes. Well, Peter, welcome to the show. I want to ask you, the White House said that, Sullivan told Yang Jiechi that the U.S. would continue to engage with China at a senior level to ensure responsible competition. First question, Mr. Yang disagrees with the characterization of this relationship by Sullivan. Not competition, probably from the Chinese side. Probably they would love to focus on cooperation between the two countries. What's your opinion on that?
My opinion is that cooperation is much to be preferred to competition, but competition is to be preferred to confrontation and direct conflict. So we're getting very different messages from the two sides. Both sides are trying to frame this positively, but the U.S. readout stressed competition at least 2 times. The Chinese readouts are stressing cooperation. The U.S. readout prominently featured the dispute over Hong Kong, Taiwan, Tibet, human rights, South China Sea. The Chinese readout de-emphasized those issues and those conflicts. So we're still getting a different message, but they're playing to different domestic constituencies. In the United States, there's very little agreement between the Democrats and Republicans. But the one thing both parties agree on is criticism of China. There's a lot of concern in the U.S. about Chinese behavior, and the U.S. is still portraying China aggressively. But the difference between this meeting and the meeting in March was stark and very important. So it's clear that the Biden administration is getting the message that berating China or trying to speak from a position of strength is not really working. So they're torn between appealing to the domestic audience and the need for improved relations. Because just very recently, the tensions have really been escalating there were some positive steps, like Ms. Meng's return to China, and positive statements by Secretary of Commerce Raimondo, and some of Biden's own comments, but there's been very heightened tension around Taiwan, and that's the most troubling to many of us, the danger of military confrontation over Taiwan and this kind of misunderstanding. So there's some positive steps and still a lot of areas for concern as we move forward.
Mm-hmm. Well, Peter, Sullivan also mentioned, responsible competition, or to manage the competition responsibly in the recent catchphrase by the U.S. side. What does that exactly mean, responsibly here?
It means avoiding a war, basically. We've had increasingly U.S. military leaders have been talking about the possibility of war with China. So we've got several different levels going on at the same time. There's the concern about war, but from the American standpoint, this is the strongest the United States is ever going to be in relation to China militarily and probably economically and politically. So the U.S. has been shoring up its alliances. Part of the rationale for the U.S. getting out of Afghanistan was so it could focus more on China. And the U.S. attempts diplomatically with its allies in Europe has been, again, to mobilize them against China. They have not wanted to be put in that position. So the U.S. has been adopting what many people refer to as a new Cold War strategy. But Biden is trying to pull back from that. If we look, however, at the people who are in this administration, you've got the Kurt Campbell essentially running the show. Campbell comes from the Center for New American Security. I think there are 16 people from that organization in the Biden administration. Those have been the ones who've been setting policy toward China. Those are the China hawks. There's also another side to Biden, and that's the side realizing that this kind of confrontational approach is going to backfire. Kerry, our climate envoy, was given an earful by the Chinese in the last meeting, saying you can't have it both ways. Either we cooperate and work together as friends, or we have a competition and the possibility of direct confrontation. Said you can't want to work with us on climate change and other things that are of interest to you, but have this confrontational approach. And I think the Biden might be hearing that now and understanding it. But again, he's torn between constituencies.
Right. Victor, U.S. senior officials previously talked about, dealing with China from position of strength. As Peter said, that's probably not working. And then now they're talking about responsible competition. Some people would say responsible competition probably for the U.S. domestic audience to make sure U.S. will win the competition.
Well, first of all, whenever I hear Washington talking about China-U.S. competition, I always find it puzzling. Why? Because they need to ask, what do China and the United States compete for? Why should they compete? The United States probably believes it's the top dog in the world, but China does not want to be the top dog. For example, China does not want to seek hegemon. There are people in Washington who believe that China's goal, they claim it to be the 100 marathon goal, is to be the next hegemon. In China, becoming a hegemon is a lot of burden.
Not popular at all.
It's not fun at all, for example. China does not want to be the next hegemon. China does not want to replace the United States as the next top dog in the world. So I think fundamentally and philosophically, China is not competing with the United States at all. Now, if the U.S. decision makers are talking about economic growth relative to each other, for example, of course, China has the right to economic development. No one in the world should deprive the Chinese people of their right to development. And any attempt to deprive China of the right to development probably will be the largest crime against humanity, because how can you hold the 1.4 billion Chinese people stopped from development, for example? So I would say when they talk about competition, they need to explain and define what exactly do they mean by China-U.S. competition. I think there is no competition. Therefore, this leaves cooperation the better default choice. China and the United States need to get along with each other. We may not exactly agree on many things, but we can figure out a way to get along with each other.
For the sake of not only the two countries, but also the entire world.
Exactly.
Well, let's leave it there for now and take a look at this week's Newsmaker. On October the 2nd, 268 peacekeepers from an engineering detachment of the 11th Chinese peacekeepers mission in South Sudan were awarded the UN Peace Medal of Honor. What were their contributions and what role does China play in UN peacekeeping? For this part, I'm joined by Zhou Bo, a senior fellow, Center for International Security and Strategy, Tsinghua University. Welcome to the show, Zhou Bo. I would like to ask you, what made the Chinese team, engineering team, stand out and win this, very important Medal of Honor?
Yeah, thank you for this good question. The medal itself is not that surprising in that everybody who have worked for peacekeeping for more than 6 months might get a medal of that. But the Chinese engineering troops are different in that these kind of equipment, like heavy trucks, so on and so forth, are what technically called force enablers, because these heavy equipment and helicopters would be more useful than ordinary soldiers holding a rifle. And talking about Chinese engineering troops, of course, they work in South Sudan. Currently, South Sudan is where the international peacekeepers are mostly found because currently, we only have about 12 peacekeeping missions around the world, and Chinese peacekeepers in South Sudan accounts for almost half of all the Chinese peacekeepers around the world. Therefore, South Sudan is the focus, and the Chinese peacekeepers are mostly concentrated in this country to help this country in protection of civilians, support of humanitarian aid, and supervision of election, and so on and so forth.
Well, Zhou Bo, as you mentioned, China has a very large contribution in terms of the number of peacekeepers. For example, China contributes the largest number of peacekeepers among the UN Security Council permanent members. And also China contributes the second largest in terms of the budget for UN peacekeeping operations. Tell us, what's behind the Chinese idea of, supporting, contributing to the international security and peace and stability?
Well, I think it has a lot of what the Chinese government want the world to see China's image, because China's rise is peaceful. Therefore, the best way for China to prove its rise is peaceful and to make contribution to the world is by sending peacekeepers around the world to keep peace, to help peace building. That is why you actually see such a huge increase in terms of Chinese peacekeeping efforts. Currently, we have about 2,263 people working in different locations of the world, but still we have registered 8,000 standby troops. If you put these two figures all together, it is more than 10,000 people, which is almost as large as quite a number of African countries as armed forces. So this is really huge, and this demonstrates our resolve to contribute more to the world.
Victor, obviously the Chinese philosophy, to me, I would use the word philosophy in terms of international security. It's a bit different from some countries, let's say. China does not boast or build a lot of military bases around the world. Instead, China respects the leadership of the UN and contributes as much as possible to the peacekeeping operations around the world. What do you make of that idea, that philosophy?
Well, I would say ever since China started reform and opening to the outside world, there are two pillars to China's huge transformation. One is to maintain stability, the other one is to defend peace. So defending peace and promoting peace is a very important philosophy for China, but also a very important practice for China. This is the fundamental reason why China supports the peacekeeping efforts of the United Nations, and China wants to contribute its share, and a very important share, to make sure that peace prevails, especially in those countries or areas where conflict is plaguing the people. They want to save people from wars, from conflicts. They want to make sure that people enjoy peace, and peace will give rise to better conditions for economic development. That's how China sees the world should be going forward.
And also, of course, China stressed very much about development, peace, stability, and development. Well, with that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests, Zhou Bo and Victor. You can also watch us on the CGTN app on our YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. You can find me on Twitter, Xu Qinduo in one word. Thank you for watching. See you next time.